Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the Zoom studio tour and talk with our 2021 Artist in Residence at the Joshua Tree Highlands Artist Residency. It's divided up into two segments. Today we'll be talking to two artists, and then on Sunday we'll be talking to our third, Beatrice Cortez. Today, we're going to be talking to Bernard Ferguson, a writer who's in Joshua Tree. And after that, and after some questions, we'll be talking to Bobby Zokaites, who is in Flamingo Heights. Feel free to put questions in the chat, and then we'll ask them afterwards. And I have to say, we're honored to have host all three of these artists, and they are spectacular as an understatement. They're all completely different, and they're all fascinating in their work and who they are as people. So enough said by us. I'm going to turn you over to Bernard and let him take it over.
Cool. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Sensational. Hello, friends. My name is Bernard. Some of you already know. I'm really happy to have been a part of this residency. I mean, it's still happening, so I'm really happy to be a part of this residency. I think I really needed to be out here during this time. And so I'm going to share some of the work that I've been working on, that I spent most of the residency working on, and also talk about the work for a little bit. So I am working on a book about the destruction of Hurricane Dorian back home in the Bahamas, and also how small island states all over the world are facing climate change. And we did very little to contribute to climate change, but yet we're the first to really be devastated by it, and the devastation's happening right now. So I came here to relax and work on this book, and I then got commissioned to write an essay in line with the book. And so I've spent most of the residency now just thinking about this essay, planning it out. I flew back home to the Bahamas for 2 weeks. The essay is about this concept called loss and damage from climate change. It's in the Paris Agreement, and it is about how no matter what we do at this point, many people across the world are going to be facing losses and damages as a result of climate change. No matter how much we limit our emissions, no matter how much we adapt our systems and prepare for it, people are going to die, systems are going to be destroyed, cities, communities, countries are going to suffer at this point, which they have been doing. They have been suffering. And this loss and damage has not been funded at all. It's been kind of, the US has led a coalition of developed nations against loss and damage because they don't want to be held liable. Developed nations don't want to be held liable for what's happening. So I wanted to write an essay about this. So I went home for 2 weeks. I witnessed the destruction that is still happening, that is still present after Hurricane Dorian. It was a really intense 10, 11 days. And then I came back and I had to write this essay. So I've been back in Joshua Tree for about 2 weeks now. But then when it was time to write, and I started realizing this is a lot. I'd witnessed a lot. I had to think about a lot. I literally went home to just witness the way my home was still unraveling and still coming apart at the seams. And going home as like this reporter was like very different for me So I didn't really think about like, oh, this is my home. Like, this is where I grew up. This is people I love and people that could be me and people that share similar stories. I witnessed a lot of their suffering. And so I came back and I tried to write and I couldn't. I made it for a while, but I started kind of breaking down a bit. Bobby knows about it. Jim and Fred know about it. I like had to call people. I was like, I kind of don't want to do this anymore. After flying home, after doing all the work to prepare, I'm like, I don't think I can. I don't think I have it in me. I was thinking about all the stories I heard, and I'm like, how do I make sense of this? How do I do right by everybody's suffering? And how do I hold the trauma that I was then feeling, or that I am now feeling? So I kind of wanted to quit. I was set to quit, to be honest. I called Jim and Fred and they were like, yeah, it's fine if you quit, but I mean, take a second to think and breathe for a second. I called some trusted friends and they were like, we would be proud of you and we'd love you if you quit. And it's important for you to take care of yourself. And so I spent the weekend just gone, just past, just kind of reeling and just thinking and trying to take care of myself. And then suddenly Monday morning at 3 a.m., my mind starts to like give me a break and I just crank out a draft of this thing. So I'm going to share with you that draft, but I did want to tell the story of like how I got here, because something I'm realizing is there's a lot of trauma happening around climate change. And that's not something I actually really, I mean, I knew it, but I never really thought about it much. But now I know it very intimately. And I have learned that as I work on this book that I'm working on, this book that I hope I get to travel for, I'm hoping I get to go to small island states all over the world, and get people's stories and put them in this book. I'm realizing I have to be in a good place before I do that. I have to have systems in place that take care of me and people around me that support me as I go about this really difficult work. So it's been a learning experience. And I never really thought about climate trauma. And so I think after this, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time maybe just thinking on this and seeing what people are thinking about what it means to be traumatized by your home being destroyed, your landscape being changed. Yeah. So before I read, I wanted to, since it's a virtual studio visit, I did want to give you all the opportunity to see how I work. So 1 second. Okay, cool. Can y'all still hear me? Okay, cool. So I had a lot on the brain and I got them all out in Post-it notes. It's not very clear as I'm seeing, but I got them all out in Post-it notes. I tried to think about all the threads I wanted to cover back home. So some of these read, this is like erosion that I saw, the mental health, the impact on mental health on the people that have survived. Oops. The impact on mental health, the erosion that I've seen on our beaches, the displacement that happened, the Bahamian refugees that are like, that don't have anywhere to go right now, the destruction of people's homes, the way water had been affected, our potable water access, how international aid had poured into our country on a scale that has never happened before. The way COVID-19 has been affecting us as we recover from the hurricane, the way our pine trees, a lot of like hundreds, thousands of our pine trees are now dead. Our mangroves are now dead. And then I just, try to organize my notes and post-it notes. They help me think through and remember all of the threads that I'm trying to track in my research as I listen to interviews, as I revisit all the things that I saw. It helps me to not keep it in my head. As a second post-it wall of post-its, and that's about climate policy. This is me just tracking the history of it and making sure I have it all in post-it notes. So then when it comes to writing, I just have to revisit it. Okay, let's. Okay. All right. Can y'all still hear me? Cool. All right. So that's my process. There's also a ton of papers all around. I don't know if you can, no, you can't see. Like papers on the floor, like I had to stress out to get a printer. It was me tracking quite a bit of information and I needed it in front of me instead of in my head. So that's just a peek at the process. And so I will read this draft that I have about, so this is about the damage and the suffering that people are still going through back home and how we don't have enough resources to recover from it, to recover from Dorian and to recover from the storms that seem to be just worse overall. So I'm going to quickly share my screen and read some of this draft for y'all so you can follow along. Okay. This doesn't have a title yet. I'm trusting my editors to just come up with a title. I'm not going to stress out about that right now. Okay. The month is currently May, the year 2021. It's been 20 months since Hurricane Dorian unleashed its cruelty on the Bahamian islands of Grand Bahama and the Abacos. And today, from the broad view of an airplane's window, the islands still appear to be wounded. Once covered in dark green foliage that complemented the Bahamas' emerald and shallow waters, the islands have faded and they appear more brown, occasionally even gray, the color of a landscape bruised. As with any landfalling hurricane, the destruction began at the shore. With fists and fervor, two-story waves blew apart long sections of the shorelines, crumbling land and uprooting trees. Our once gorgeous mangrove swamps that serve as habitat for the like of algae, sea turtles, crabs, and bonefish, and also helped defend the land against a storm surge, were overwhelmed by Dorian's salt water, and large swaths of them lay dead, their gray, brittle shells shimmering in the Bahamas' golden heat. The same fate befell our pine trees. Indigenous to the region, the Caribbean pine covered most of the islands with tall, slender barks and round bulbs of foliage. But because they need fresh water to survive, when the ocean stretched upon the land and sat there for days, it killed acres of them. It takes some decades for pines to arrive at their mature, untowering height of 65 feet, not meters. And for unbearable stretches, Dorian cleaved down multiple generations of varying heights, all the same. Today, interspersed between the dead mangroves and the fields of mangled bark, there are neighborhoods that are still marred, concrete remains toppled, roofs are missing, and debris scattered. Some blocks look akin to the aftermath of rapture. Those taken were not taken gently, and those granted enough mercy to survive have stories of survival so harrowing and exceptional, they approach the point of legend. One man was flung high into a massive gum elmy and found a way to remain there until rescue arrived. Another man was almost swept away by the flood, but managed to hang on to the trunk of a tree. By the end of the storm, he had no skin left on his arms. While standing in her yard, her still battered home behind us, Jacana Theok tells me how she and her 5 children endured 3 terrifying days inside the storm. The sky above is calm, with fading pink clouds as Miss Theok tells me that the storm trapped them inside their home. They spent nearly 12 hours standing atop their countertops as their living room and kitchen filled with water. And at one point, nearly neck deep in it, she tells me that her oldest son said, "Mummy, I can't feel my legs." She takes a pause to look up at the darkening sky, the stars now becoming visible, and then wipes away a few tears before she continues. Somehow they escaped. Somehow, after retreating into retreating into the attic, after a bout with snakes, and after climbing over a barbed wire fence, and she and her family are by some miracle still alive, but their house remains gutted. The water climbed so high it eventually met the ceiling, and it destroyed everything they owned. Very slowly, she and her husband have begun repairs. But the reason it's taking so long, she tells me, is because we're literally doing this out of pocket. Before Bahamians, before the colonizers and the slaves they dragged to these islands, it was in large part the indigenous Taino that cultivated these lands. They thought hurricanes arrived due to the powers of the semis, or divine deities. The Taino feared and respected these semi. Their abilities often left Taino communities devastated and their crops ruined. I'm gonna increase the font really quickly. Before nearly exterminating them, European colonizers studied their practices and learned how to best prepare for hurricanes. Their understanding served as the basis for the understanding of hurricanes during the time of colonization, and it continues to serve as the basis for Bahamians today. But even with that knowledge passed down to us through generations and forged through centuries of experience, Dorian beats anything we Bahamians ever thought a hurricane could be capable of. In reference to worsening hurricanes, Professor Catherine Hayhoe, atmospheric scientist and co-director of at the Climate Science Center at Texas Tech University, once said that the question, was it caused by climate change, is a less relevant question than how much worse did climate change make it. In general, hurricanes are thought to be the Earth's natural mechanism to ferry excess heat from the equator to the poles. If you consider this planet the same as I do, as a hollowed living thing, then the Taino were right. Hurricanes are acts of divine measure. It's the planet's attempt to achieve equilibrium. With the global average ocean temperature having increased nearly 1 degree Celsius, there is now considerably more heat in the tropics. And so the planet's transfer of that heat to the poles has become more powerful, and the lives of those that live in its path more precarious. And like tweaking the power of any already powerful God, even minuscule increases in hurricane strength can lead to catastrophic effects. According to the US National Weather Service, while an increase in wind speed from 75 miles per hour to 150 miles per hour is a twofold increase, it actually equates to a 256 times increase in damage potential. The strongest hurricanes to have made landfall in the Bahamas have topped out at 160 miles per hour sustained wind speed, while Dorian's sustained wind speed was 185 miles per hour. And though that's only a 16% difference, the same scale from the National Weather Service equates that Dorian actually had more than 3 times the damage power. With such a sensitive and logarithmic dynamic, for Bahamians, every mile per hour has to count. And it seems there are just a handful of them that span the difference between tearing down power lines and cutting through concrete. The consequences are apparent. Dorian's destruction was indiscriminate, and the damage inflicted was estimated at 3.4 billion US, just about one fourth of the Bahamas' 2019 gross domestic product, and more than 5 times that of 2016's Hurricane Matthew, the former costliest storm in Bahamian history. The Bahamas' carbon footprint is microscopic, and like small island states across the globe, it is facing the costs of severe losses and damages from a problem it contributed very little to. Given the long-known imbalance between the most culpable contributors to climate change and those who are set to suffer most from it, the question of who should be held accountable for the losses and damages of climate change is not a new one. In fact, the question has been asked for the past 3 decades, and it is even included in the Paris Agreement. So this is far too long for me to read all of it. I'm going to just read one more section that's interesting to me. This section talks about the Paris Agreement and how loss and damage is in it. And in order to get loss and damage in the Paris Agreement, small island states had to fight against largely the US and the European Union to negotiate for it to be there in the Paris Agreement. The US and the European Union are very much not interested in being liable and not interested in paying for any losses and damages that occurs because of climate change in any other country, even though it is largely because of countries like the US that cause it. I'm just gonna get to this point that's very interesting to me, which is about the US trying to control hurricanes. In the 1940s, American doctor Erwin Langmuir hypothesized that he could weaken a hurricane by flying ice crystals into the storm's eye wall. None of his experiments proved successful. A decade later, two terrible hurricanes made landfall in the United States in 1954 and 1955, one of which inflicted damages upwards of $1 billion for the first time in US history. Given the exorbitant costs of the storms, President Eisenhower became enthralled by Dr. Langmuir's experiments and thought that controlling them or weakening them could prove worthwhile. The effort was called Project Storm Fury, and its funding was authorized by Congress. The project had varying rates of success, but ultimately there weren't enough consistent hurricanes to further the research, and so the project came to an end in 1983. Since then, all the project's attempts that were thought to be successful at weakening hurricanes were proven to be false or inconclusive. Conversely, by way of innovation and burning an enormous amount of fossil fuels, the United States became the #1 carbon emitter in the 1970s, right around the beginning of the industrial era, and remained in that position for more than 130 years. Since then, the average temperature of the planet has warmed by nearly 1 degree Celsius, swelling the heat available in the tropics. Though the United States has failed at weakening hurricanes, it has extensively contributed to making them worse. For the sake of time, that's where I'm going to stop. If there are any questions, folks can feel free to post them in the chat. And yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me. And also, if there's if you want me to read more, maybe later after Bobby's done, I can read like maybe a section at the end or something. But yeah, thanks so much. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now.
Well, thank you so much, Bernard. We think that's fascinating. And I think now, unless anybody has any questions, we're going to get to hear from the infamous Bobby Zokaites.
I wanted to share something.
Wait a second. Before that, Fred wanted to share something.
So I just personally wanted to say something to you, Bernard, about you sharing your process and how your recent trip back to your home really affected you and affected the way that you're actually looking at your story that you're working on. I think that says a lot about you as a writer. And I hope that by you sharing this, it will help other people realize the importance of the island nations and how our actions, both personally and as a country, affect other nations on the planet. So thank you for sharing that with us, and I hope to read your book soon. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Bobby.
And Bernard, I just want to point out that that first excerpt is more personable. There was a different cadence and a different flow to the description of your home. That's more intimate than has been in your previous writing as well. And I thought it was beautiful. Just saying. Anyway, guys, I am very much in a different point in what I've been doing here. I came here to work on weavings, as you can see right here. And I've been kind of working on them for a while, and I've worked on several other things while I have been here. It's been actually a really great space to be in. Steve has been a wonderful host, and he's actually thought about a lot of the same problems, and we've approached them in slightly different ways, and sometimes we've approached them in the exact same ways. One of those examples is I'm actually doing a commission in Tempe right now of sundials, which is something that Steve has had a lot of experience with. And so this is the rough sketch for a floor dial that's going to be made next year. This is called a spider dial, and it tells watch time, civic time. That's why it's squiggly. And it will look like this is a larger concept sketch of what that project is, where that spider dial will go in the floor. Some of the benches will have numbers on it. And then there's also vertical shade screens that are going to go into a shade canopy for it to be a meeting space. That's been one of the side projects that I've been working on here. And it's been wonderful having Steve to go through that. These smaller weavings, which is primarily what I came here to work on. In fact, we were able to solicit a donation of 50,000 feet worth of paracord in multiple colors to facilitate that. And to tell you a little bit about the process, I'll tell you that it took a while to get to the point of organizing the warp, which I've been doing with this. This is a drawing of the bracket, actually, and these notches organize the vertical strings. And then actually this inner side is a new development, synthesize it in C, which will actually help me have what's called a casting on, speed up my casting on process where you lace up the loom. It's kind of technical. And then that enables us to organize the weaving in such a way that we can get different patterning. Another thing that I've been working on actually is called caning. And so this is one of the first cane surfaces. It's the same as a caned chair. And it sort of makes this whole object I feel wholer and more solid than previous iterations. And just as an example of the weave structure and the different color palettes, I've been using the same weave structure, and meaning the pattern within the weave are the same, but you can see the different color applications and how that sort of affects the aesthetic. Again, you can see there's a diamond in blue against purple with a lighter blue to get this like blue studded effect. And that's the same thing on this one, which has a yellow base. And then that has evolved into, over the course of the residency, more sculptural sort of investigations, more complex forms. This joint is actually an ellipse and not a circle. So it affects it in a different way. Again, using the same weave structure, you can see that diamond in there. And then larger investigations, such as this object, which is a caned, it's a quadruple caned surface. meaning there's a gray cane surface that sits 1 inch in front of an orange cane surface, which sits 6 inches in front of another set. Starting to look at like layers of surface within a sculpture. And if you guys are wondering, surface is one of those pieces of jargon, if you will, for a sculptor, like part of the illustration of the vernacular is the surface. And then if you'll bear with me, I'm going to take you guys outside to look at a larger thing, because I like making work at a scale. Doing the smaller stuff is good, helps you think through practical exercises, it lets you do surface treatment tests. But it gets really exciting when you can immerse yourself in the actual thing. And so to that pursuit, I have prepared and prototyped a much larger loom situation. This is my shed device, which is a component. I've been abstracting tapestry looms. And so this is a real simple 2-shaft loom. I can move the strings up and down with a lever. There are 8 levers. And then we've also customed out different shuttles. I also have custom combs, which help comb the weaving. And there's 2 different sizes because it changes across the curvature. And this is a proof of concept for a larger loom that I get to build in about a month and a half. That's going to contain 34 pneumatic cylinders. So which eliminates, I have to currently on the prototype, I have to walk completely around it, which while it is a much faster process than these small things that were hand woven with an upholstery needle. So the small ones were done with this process, using this tool to create the pattern. And I was pulling through like 20 feet of thread at a time. Whereas on the larger loom, it seems obvious, but using a shuttle to pass the string through at the same time is a much faster process than the small stuff. And if I eliminate the need to walk around, I think I can get up to where I'm weaving 5 or 6 feet in a day comfortably. And what that's going to do is that's going to enable me to create large enough tapestries to fill a space. And so I can get a rich surface that's filled with detail at an intimate scale, and create an environment of that, you know, and do it so the viewer can be immersed into it. Which brings me to, I've got one more drawing I would like to share with you guys, which is the actual weaving is one investigation, and then the caning is a similar investigation. And this is just a drawing that I've done in the last 2 days for a much larger sculpture, where I can make a 7-foot diameter circle wheel and suspend the central hub from 2 caned surfaces to get an inner space that is full of texture, and then having them spin around a central axle in an offset fashion means they'll spin at different rates. And so the optical illusion of seeing the weaving as it's spinning is going to be, I think, pretty trippy. But it's getting down to the point where there's lots of design solutions, which is, and at the midterm, it was brought up, the question was, what is the difference between manufacturing and art? And I kind of think that we call that venture capitalism. I don't know. But for a sculptor, it's hard to divorce the process and the material and the efficiency and the knowledge and the quality of the sculpture of what you're making. It's sort of all in a bag, and you kind of have to deal with it all at the same time. Anyway, that's my studio visit. I see we have a question. We have a question about materiality. And then Kara asks about the history and the weaving. Paracord is a material that was developed in World War II specifically for parachutes. Its nickname is 580 cord, meaning one strand of it will hold 580 pounds. We decore it. We actually, the donation we got is of a decord. Normally it's got a 7 weave inside of a nylon sheath. And we're just using the sheath, that's why it lays flat. But there's an abstraction in the process. Like I'm using a petroleum product, I'm using a nylon, a plastic, and applying it to an older craft. And I'm getting very rich textures, which I think is also another signifier that on the front end, I've brought in this 3D modeling layout tool, right? To try to get a different quality of surface than was available with older materials applied in the same way. There's cultural connections to specific kind of weavings. I'm from Phoenix, and the natives in Arizona have their own rich tradition. Some of it is very much guarded and some of it is very open. I grew up in Appalachia in Virginia, where sort of the history of like the Irish moving in and all these people being in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and they still identify very much with frontier life, and they very much still identify with like a coal miner's life. And so the skills are apparent in the community and still used, right? Like there's a likelihood that women will still go to prom in a dress that their mom sewed for them. It's still very much a real part of the culture there. And then I also found out, I was doing research last week, historically I'm from Lithuania. My great-grandparents came over in the wake of the Russian Revolution, but there's specifically a lace community in Lithuania that is redoing the research to try to reclaim the craft that was lost during the Soviet rule in the 20th century. And so it's a much more intimate and diverse set of skills and investigation than say like welding, which like I'm a certified welder, I weld big things together. But it doesn't have the same cultural impact. It has welding and foundry work has an industrial understanding, and you understand looking at those objects. Whereas weaving, even weaving done on a mechanized loom, has a hand quality to it, intimacy that is very much different, a different form of manufacturing. That's sort of where my thoughts are. Hey Beatrice, what do you got?
Welding can be like weaving.
It can be, right? It can very much be like weaving. It is. I used to tell people when I saw a sewing machine, I saw the opposite of a table saw because they're all straight lines, you know?
Yeah, I don't think there's any more questions.
What about, oh, yes, finish it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We really appreciate this. We're really fascinated by your work. Everyone who sees it is. If no one has any further questions, do you?
I have a
Well,
question.
I just wanted to say how much we're thankful for you guys sharing. I mean, as the past year that we've gone through, it's been challenging for all of us to actually interact and get together and communicate ideas. And you guys have really come forward to do that. I mean, we had a get together, our first get together since the last 2 years, and it was amazing. And people really responded to what you shared at that event. So the fact that you've come today to let people in and hear a little bit more about who you are as an individual and as an artist, and what you offer on a cultural level for people to understand how important the arts are. And that's part and parcel of why we do this residency, because we like to be able to communicate ideas that can actually help change the world and make it a better place. And I think all of you on your individual level, you strive towards that. And we appreciate that you have that heartfelt energy and creative spirit that you share with us and with the world. And I can't say enough about this, because especially in the time that we live in, it is really important. And it's really important that people understand why we need people to support the arts and support artists. And I want to thank all of you for standing up and being beacons of light for what you believe in as artists. Thank you. My soap opera.
Beatrice, do you have something to say?
Yeah, I would love to ask a couple questions. I've been thinking a lot about a question that somebody asked you, Bobby, when you were speaking at your studio the other day. And I think it was super interesting, because I love the way in which the weaving that you're making has all this math and all this technology that speaks of modernity, but also speaks of ancient times all at once. And I love how it collapses time or exists in different temporalities or simultaneities. And I think somebody asked you something about, I forgot, it doesn't matter. It was something about how maybe we have to define it. I forgot. It doesn't matter exactly the question, but it was an effort to define it. And I thought you said, what's the difference? And you refused to define it because it existed for you in all these different temporalities. And I wanted to ask you about that, because I think it's really interesting, for example, how by doing that, you're also making visible how ancient forms of weaving also had like this really complicated math and these really complicated structures to looms, even if they were made in the simplest way, sometimes just wrapped around somebody's waist and hanging from a tree, right? And so I wanted to ask you to speak about how all these designs that you're showing us for the sundial could be ancient and could exist without this modernity of the drawing that we see, and how it oscillates, because I think that's super interesting. And then I had a question for Bernard, but I'll ask it later.
That's actually a really great point, Beatrice. Sundials, there were 14 sundials in the Western world before Euclid. And Euclid is the guy who postulated geometry, right? Gave us the grid on the cube, is Euclid's contribution. Somewhere around, I don't know, a few hundred BC. And then actually mathematics, yes, it ebbs and flows, and who understands it, which cultures understand it, and that sort of stuff after that. But there's not really a major mathematical advancement until, and the understanding of mathematics until the 1980s with the computers, right? We rearticulate chaos into refined order, and we can do math on high-powered amounts of math on groups of numbers. They call that modern algebra, which is the class I dropped out of in math and college. But yeah, as soon as Euclid comes in, things like the sundials are very accurate. In fact, the railroad companies in the 19th century were still using sundials to establish the legend that is how efficient trains are run was done on a sundial, right? Because that was before wristwatches. And the plumb bob is a crazy technological advance as far as sundials are concerned. And again, the point of weaving, I mean, we talk about history, the history in Phoenix, and the Anasazi and pre, all of that. There's 3 epics of basket weavers who preserved their dead with yucca baskets buried in the sand. And they're 6 millennia old, and those yucca baskets come out fully intact. It's a crazy, it is a crazy craft as far as like it's durable. It holds up to a lot of things. There's cultures that use it for water carrying devices. And I do think that is the point of trying to collapse sort of the distance between the two new technologies, both in a material way and in a process way, into older craft to see sort of where the aesthetics can be accentuated and where the thoughts go. Because we can't, the solution to climate change isn't a new technology, right? The solution to climate change is very much a local solution. So like, you know, in some ways using a petroleum product, because everything that we use today is a petroleum product. So it is kind of local, but like getting into baskets and stuff, or getting into domiciles, like the dirt in Phoenix is good enough to build buildings that last 2 millennia. Like we have proof of that. And so the solution is individual responsibility and understanding and manipulation of local materials into recycling, right? And so there's some ethos there in learning the older crafts and applying the newer technologies to it, you know, and helping with that learning culturally.
No, it's really beautiful, and it makes me think of the Maya buildings and how, you know, other people measured the movement of the sun, etc. And I think it's really beautiful how it moves back and forth from different spaces and temporalities.
I mean, it's super crazy, like math, much like written language, like math and how the philosophers articulated mathematics is very much an articulation of nature, right? It's another logic form to express and define that. And so it makes sense that sundials, we can update it, we can embed the equation of time into the surface. We can make it so you don't have to recalibrate it for daylight savings time. I can live in a state that doesn't do daylight savings time. Whereas, you know, they couldn't do that even 40 years ago. It would be a pain to use, to recalibrate it, put the grid on it in such a way that you don't have to recalibrate it every day. But it's still very much, the sun in relationship to the earth has not really changed its pattern since the ancients were thinking about it.
Yeah, and it's super interesting. And I also had a question for you, Bernard, about a similar idea. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about, I mean, I don't come from the Caribbean, but I do come from the tropics. And I think a lot about what it means to migrate and to move from one landscape to another landscape, etc. And I thought it was really interesting to hear you talk about going back home, especially because you haven't been able to go back home for a while, and going back home in the middle of a pandemic and thinking about writing this book and in this article. And I think that's so difficult because we already are experiencing so much loss. And so I loved how you go back to thinking about the islands in terms of the Taino culture and how they saw the islands. And I think it's interesting to hear you speak about going back home, and I wanted to ask you about that idea of the island existing in different times, before it was the Bahamas and before it was what we imagine it to be, or what is marketed as being in for tourism, right? Which is the worst thing that has happened to it. And you describe it as being brown and the opposite of these tourist sites, which is interesting, right? And so I wanted to ask you how moving across these different temporalities and points of view shows you a different island.
It was a while. I think that's a packed question.
Sorry.
No. I mean, it's not in the sense of it's too much, but in the sense of that's putting language to the tug of war inside me. I don't know. I feel I described the pine trees. I described the mangroves. I described how from above they're just clearly brown and if you go to a different island, it's clearly vibrant, lush green. And it's been 2 years, so it's going to be a while before they bounce back. And will they have the chance to bounce back? The only thing I can speak to right now is the splitting apart that I feel is happening inside of me as I work on this. There's this quote by Banu Kapil in her book Schizophrene, and she says, to draw a line between two places on a map is psychotic. And it's, to me, that has spoken a lot to what it means to live both as a Bahamian and call the Bahamas my home, and to have struggled so long in the US and trying to get a green card to call this place my home, while this place continues to engage in practices that is destroying my home. And so as I write this article, this essay, this book, at first I thought maybe I was, the scale at which the climate's changing, the planet's changing, the landscape has not happened in its history, the scale and the speed, right? It always changes over millions of years, over millennia, but not at the speed at which man is causing it to change, right? And it has never happened in the context of human history. And so never in human, and also it's changing while we have access to watching it change all over the place, right? We have social media, and I can watch someone from Kiribati talk about how their home is underwater right now. So it isn't these are happening and we don't know about them happening. It's very hyper visible all over, everywhere. So never has something collectively happened to the human race like this. Never has something happened to the world at this kind of speed and this scale. And so I'm realizing this is throwing me into a kind of madness because the language for this doesn't exist. We've never had to put, no one has ever had to communicate about how 1 billion people are changing the landscape for the other 6 billion people. Never has English, I don't know if English can grasp it. How do we, it's just never been done. And I'm realizing, there's models, there's I know there's thinkers and people who have been aware and who think on this level. And I just before I thought of myself as now trying to translate. I am from the Bahamas. I'm from an island state who's on the front lines, whose landscape is on the front lines. And I have access to the New York Times, and I have access to American media for a second. I have a chance to translate something. But like I said, I'm deeply feeling, and I felt it for my 10 years in this country, but I'm feeling it at a crest point right now. To draw a line between two places, it is psychotic. And I feel like my mind is splitting apart. So to return home after the pandemic, after so much loss, I like to also return in like I haven't been well, you know what I mean? Like this pandemic hasn't been that good to me. And so like going home in a state when I'm not well, when I don't have the support that I need, going through the trauma of holding other people's trauma, holding the trauma in land, trying to expand my scope to understand it separate from Bahamians, understand the long view. It's a lot is the answer to your question. Like, I don't like, it just feels like a lot inside of me. And I'm interested in doing this work, but I don't know. I operate on a mode of wonder, of like being bewildered by the world, and I am not bewildered. I am finding it very difficult to be bewildered by this work. To be bewildered by flying in a plane and looking down on Bahamian islands and seeing them like look like a landscape that is essentially a graveyard of trees and mangroves and life. I keep like this is like I think I've been having nightmares about like these pine trees. They're normally tall and they have green at the top and there's forests of them, they're thick, but now there's just like a landscape of them, like they're just cut in half and they're not tall anymore. And the ones that are still tall, all of their green are like gone. And so it looks like winter in a way that winter has never looked on the island, where it's just like trees without foliage and they're just permanently that way. So yeah, witnessing, understanding, trying to make sense of, uttering a thing about it it feels psychotic. It feels like it's ripping my mind apart a bit. And I'm struggling to find a way to be bewildered by it. That's not to say I don't think I won't find it. It's just, I have to hold out for it, I think.
Very, very fascinating, intriguing. Thank you, Bernard, for sharing that. Thank you, Bobby, for sharing your work and your thoughts. Thank you, Beatrice, for the conversation. Just to remind everybody that there will be a Zoom talk with Beatrice and Alma Ruiz, who partnered with us for the Alma Ruiz Fellowship on Sunday from 3 to 5. And we're sure that will be fascinating. So from our hearts, we thank the artists. We thank all of you who joined us, who appreciate the artists. And just as a final reminder, we've been doing the residency for 15 years, and we're doing a 15-year retrospective of the collection from the JTHAR artists, and that's going to be at the San Bernardino County Museum from September to January 2021. The opening date is September 18th from 3 to 5, and you're all welcome to come. We'd like to see you there, and we really enjoyed seeing you here today. So thank you.